I used to have an attic full of comic books, you know, Doctor Strange, Fantastic Four were great. I loved The Thing, and, you know, Fantastic Four being hit by the cosmic rays. They went through the Van Allen radiation belt, and that's what gave them their bizarro powers.
So tell me the first time you fell in love with Chairman Mao.
Are we rolling here?
You're in high school.
Right. Well, you see, back in the 60s, you had this, the split between the old left was Stalin and the Soviet Union, and the new left had to find some type of icon to glom onto, so of course it would be Chairman Mao. And there was, of course, a split between the Soviet Union and Communist China. And Soviet Union was revolution in one country, and Communist China was endless revolution everywhere. So Mao was the global approach, right? And a revolution without borders, revolution without end, because it was the Cultural Revolution. It was a non-ending revolution. But the book that got me, and of course everybody was waving the little red book. Yeah,
so
the
set the scene here. You're in high school or college?
I'm in high school.
Okay.
I'm
the
in
new left
like
is coming.
ninth grade. This is the 1960s. The new left is on a tear, right? You've got the Vietnam War, and you've got the Civil Rights Movement. You've got the Black Panthers, and the country's in turmoil. And the Little Red Book is the Bible for the Black Panther Party. They sell it as a fundraising device. I think it went for $1 a copy. And Chairman Mao's essay on contradiction was the tract that really that really hooked me. And the White Panthers were the group I was involved with. And the White Panther Party, their slogan was rock and roll, dope, and fornication in the streets. They were trying to make us all believe that the youth, the hippie revolution, the youth revolution was somehow a revolutionary movement. Okay. And a Marxist-Leninist, affiliate somehow.
Were they loosely affiliated with the Black Panthers, or nothing?
Nothing official, okay. But they were, sympathizers.
Okay.
And they were. I think they were just trying to be cool by, they wanted to. The cool thing, as always, with the white liberals, the white radicals, is to follow the lead of the black radicals. Okay. It's like And one of the books on the reading list was On Contradiction by Mao Zedong. And in that, I think it's Mao trying to glom onto the Chinese philosophers or reinterpret the Chinese philosopher of yin and yang, and reinterpret that as dialectical materialism. That which is weak becomes strong, and that which is strong becomes weak. Everything turns into its opposite. Yeah. And if you want to see the evolution of society or the evolution of any material manifestation, you have to look at the small to see what will become the big. And
so how'd you feel about that? Were you like, all right, I feel the secret of the universe.
Yeah, exactly.
I've got the secret.
Yeah,
right.
And it was actually, and that's true, that's a very good way to put it, I found the secret of the universe, and it was beyond dialectical materialism, and it was beyond Marxism. It was really this more, occult philosophy of the inner workings of all manifested reality. The secret of the universe that I found wasn't Marxism and economic determinism. It was this vision of this understanding of everything turns into its opposite. Change is constant. The only constant is change, and everything becomes its opposite. And that which is strong becomes weak, and that which is weak becomes strong, and that which is ascendant will descend.
It's interesting because that's what James Billington, the Library of Congress director, he wrote. He passed away recently, actually. He wrote the book Fire in the Minds of Men, which was a detailed chronicling of the rise of these revolutionary movements in Europe. And he tied them directly to the salons of the aristocrats and the occult. That there was this idea of trying to create this, birthing this fire in the minds of men that would electrify a new world order. They're creating these symbols of of how the world should be remade in the image of these values, and that it required a revolutionary fervor that would spill some blood to initiate this. And he was just simply using primary sources to document the funding of both some of the centrist style, moderate revolutionary fervors, and also the more radical ones, and showing how both sides were working hand in hand with the elites. And I think I see parallels with what you just described there about the occult there. That's interesting. And then I also see that with the rise of what I call the corporate communists, which is all these big giant corporations funding radical tear down movements, tear down statues, tear down everything. So you have this weird alliance between big corporatists and communists that goes back hundreds of years ago, and even in Europe and so forth.
Right. No, I've written about that. It's a misapprehension to say corporatism and communism are opposed. The big corporations are opposed to communism. No, traditionally they've actually been united. It's big versus small is again, to use the Maoist phrase, or the Marxist or the dialectical materialist, the dialectical jargon. You look for the primary contradiction in any situation. What's the primary contradiction in society? Classical Marxism says it's between the working class and the capitalist or the bourgeoisie. So the primary contradiction is between big and small. The big government and big corporations, global corporations, actually are on the same side. And Gabriel Kotko, in The Triumph of Conservatism, has written about this, how the first progressive era, you saw the regulation, the regulatory state really being blown up, being born, growing in its first spurt of growth, was actually being used to entrench big capital and entrench big corporations. The House of Morgan and the interlocking boards of directors of the various industrial corporations, which all went back to the House of Morgan, they were doing everything they could to stamp out competition. There was new innovation coming along all the time, new car companies, new auto, new processes for this and that, and they couldn't keep, the largest players couldn't keep ahead of the competition. They tried to buy them out, but then new ones would spring up. So they determined that the best way to do this is through government regulation. And the regulatory state would erect barriers to entry for new players. Right. And they could accommodate the regulation. The big guys had the lawyers, they had the accountants, they had everything, the lobbyists, they had the ins to the Teddy Roosevelts and whatnot to get their way enshrined in regulation. But the little guys, that would be walled off and walled out. Now see today, the large corporations bending a knee to BLM and going along with the whole inclusive diversity, that's really historically in line with they're more than happy to accommodate, okay, we'll hire so many of these, so many of those, so many of those, and call ourselves diverse, but have they really changed anything? If they were serious about their concerns about income inequality, lack of opportunity, the stagnation of wages and living standards in America, they would bring back all the jobs they outsourced to these third world slave labor havens and cheap labor havens. But they don't do that. Instead, they make these, I would say, token payments to political activists and political activism, and make these obligatory statements of we care, we care, we care.
So it's like indulgences, like in the Catholic Church, right? You're making indulgences to allow you to be excessive.
They're trying to buy absolution, right?
Yeah, for your decadence. They do that with the carbon credit thing, right? You pay to have trees planted, and then you get to be a wasteful polluter or whatever.
Yeah, the whole cap and trade scheme that they tried to.
It's a reciprocal tit for tat kind of thing, okay? Yeah. Instead of a transformation that actually has real lasting benefit for everyone. You know, that's the way I look at it. The reason why I'm so skeptical of politics itself is that when I look at politics, whenever we go to politics to try to add some kind of new power for government, it always is a win-lose proposition. It's always a zero-sum game because the government has to take something or change something from here to give to there. But when we go outside of that space, then you can have win-win solutions.
Yeah.
Right? It's not win. So for you, when you make the combustion engine in the automobile, that's a win-win solution if it's not forced, into by the state taking from the horseshoe makers. Now, at the end of the day, you could say it's a lose for the horseshoe makers, because all those horse guys aren't going to have their business as well because we've got the car. But for all of society, including the guys that were making the horseshoes for the world of the horse and carriage, they're going to win because they're going to have a car and they're going to be able to get around and see grandma better or take her to the beach. Maybe,
in a quite practical sense, the horseshoe maker, the guy that used to make horseshoes, is probably now making tools.
Right.
I mean, the clearest example, and if you get rid of the racial discrimination, which was a very real thing, you had armies, literal armies of people picking cotton in the Mississippi Delta. When the mechanical cotton picker came along, you didn't need the army of cotton pickers anymore, and many of them went to the northern industrial states and became employed in the plants that were building the mechanical cotton pickers.
Right, and that's because immoral choices oftentimes are actually not efficient. You know what I mean? Like immoral ways of solving problems actually aren't the best way to solve problems. They feel like it sometimes in the context of people who have abandoned the morality of what they're doing. They've shrunken their perspective. But when the big scale of things, actually immoral shortcuts to achieve certain ends, like enslaving people, actually aren't actually efficient. They're actually not the way to solve things the best way. I mean, just think about like burning witches to solve the plague. They did that all over the world, thousands of years. They burn witches. Okay, we got a plague. It's because someone put a spell on us or someone is doing something evil. I think it's him or her. You burn them. Feel better? I think the plague will go away soon. Not really. Actually, look at that bacteria on that man's nose. That's where the plague came from. Look a little closer. Oh, wait a second. So burning witch doesn't stop the plague. So now you have to actually think of, well, what's causing this relationship that's causing us all problems? And that's where the market, that's where science, that's where innovation comes in, and it's a win-win solution. Because if you say, wait a second, penicillin, I'll take the penicillin over the burning of the witch. You know what I mean? You know what I mean? Take the penicillin as a win-win, right?
Right.
The burning of the witch, not a win. It's a win-lose. Somebody had to take one for the team. And I think Marxism, as a philosophy, because we're talking about this in the context of the things that we're seeing in America, Marxism doesn't understand that. It doesn't understand that you can have win-win solutions. And Marx was, he's not the cartoon we make him out to be in popular critiques of Marx in conventional media, where he hates capitalism. He doesn't hate capitalism. He sees that he's created this scientific, objective view of the trajectory of history, and he praises capitalism for having had a liberating effect away from the period before it,
creating
feudalism,
the industrial,
So he sees it as a very good force in some sense, but a force that inevitably is still not where humanity is moving. That scientifically humanity is moving in that Hegelian direction towards the classless state of utopia. And that's what attracted you, right, to Mr. Mao, Chairman?
I guess so. The idea of progress towards some nirvana.
Marx gets that. That's microwaved, cheap imitation of Christianity. That's the idea of that history is going somewhere. Right?
Yeah.
It's on a trajectory.
Yeah.
The kingdom of God is advancing. That in the classical world of the Greeks and the pagan world, you had the idea of the eternal return. You had the constant cyclical process.
Right.
Christianity comes in and puts a linear perspective into history that we're moving somewhere.
Right.
We're going somewhere.
Right.
And then the question becomes, well, how do you advance that trajectory? Do you advance it by force? Or do you advance it by some other project like maybe Jesus was suggesting? But nevertheless, the idea of a linear, where you get the Whig view of history, All these things are borrowed from the Christian imagination and the Judeo-Christian imagination. There's something moving, that we're going towards somewhere. It begins in a garden, and it ends in a city of God coming to earth, right? And so folks are always trying to think, okay, how can I advance that? Even though they may not be explicitly Christian, they're in that fishbowl of Christianity and its aesthetic of linear progress in history, and folks are always wrestling with, well, how do we get this thing going? How do we observe this? How does this actually move? And Marx said it comes through struggle, it comes through bloodshed, right? It comes through that dialectical tension that resolves in a breakthrough of consciousness that allows the people to claim their next stage in that evolution of liberation, right?
I think one of the most interesting things about Marx is to understand about him is that he was a self-hating Jew. I mean, if you read his essay on the Jewish question, the first iteration of Marxism is basically anti-Semitism. He didn't hate the capitalist, he hated the Jew. He saw the Jew as the money-grubbing, evil person that he later, in later iterations, universalized into the capitalist class, the bourgeois class. So it was the Jew who worshipped money. It was the Jew who taught the Christian how to be a capitalist, how to oppress others in the service of money. It was the Jew who did all this. I mean, Lenin, I think it was Lenin who said, anti-Semitism is socialism for the ignorant. Well, that makes the first ignoramus Karl Marx himself, who was a Jew and who, like so many other Jews of that period, really hated themselves because they wanted to assimilate and become part of the Christian Europe, and saw the Jewish religion and the Jewish identity as this backward kind of, peasant cult, whatever. Yeah, because this was the age of rationalization and rationalism and intelligence and science, and Judaism is a religion of legalism and is all in service to this unpronounceable God, right? But we're beyond that now, right? We're beyond that. There's a more rational and reasonable explanation for everything, and please accept me into your society. So Marxism and the whole leftism of this idea that the capitalist class is, the rich are bad and the rich are oppressing the rest of the world is really ersatz anti-Semitism. I mean, it's basically, it's peas in a pod.
They say that theology is autobiographical, right? And so you look at the biography of the individual and you'll find a lot of where they get their ideas. So if politics is theology in some sense too, which I think is pretty close. So what does that, what's in Karl Marx's biography that allows him to have this self-hatred that you're identifying here and the way he expresses it?
And he said, we'll get rid of money and then we won't need Jews anymore.
Right. So we've set the ground for Marxism. How has that become so sticky in the minds of the Chinese? Do you have any idea?
Well, Mao's try to reinterpret ancient Chinese wisdom into dialectical materialism helped stick it in the minds of the elite Communist Party. But look, China, like everybody else, every other nation on earth wants to develop, wanted to industrialize, wants to raise its standard of living, and nothing does that like Western industrialism, or Western industrial development. And they tried it the Soviet fashion, right? And they started, 30 years later, 40 years later. It wasn't until they abandoned the pretense of adherence to Marxism that they were able to industrialize and really raise their standard of living. Deng Xiaoping and everybody else came along and pretended, we want to become capitalists, we want to become Western, we want to become, more like you, Western Europe, United States, please help us, right? They, like the Meiji, the Meiji Restoration of Japan 100 years later, or 120 years later. I think it's simply, it hasn't become sticky in the minds of the Chinese people. There's only 60 million members of the Chinese Communist Party in a nation of 1.5 billion people, right? Yeah. So what it is, it's a Leninist party, and it's all about holding on to power. We don't want to share power. There'll be a one-party state. The party will control the state, will control the government. You're not going to have an independent, neutral civil service that, no, everybody answers to the commissar and answers to the communists and to the Leninist authorities here. So It's about holding on to power.
And but they have, the reason I think they've been effective, I guess, in doing this is they have more of a longer game than America, right?
Absolutely.
Because America has a messianic complex about its destiny to rule, you know.
But we spread by example.
Right.
We don't seek to conquer. We're not. We don't conquer by the sword. The American Revolution was a rebellion against globalism.
Right.
The global economy was called the British Empire. Remember the British Empire? Britannia ruled the waves. British industry was not just superior to all, it was a monopoly. I mean, British had a corner on industrial revolution and industrial techniques. They were the low-cost producer of textiles, of iron and steel. They pretty much had the game to themselves. They saw the world, it was a global economy. It was globalization 1.0. We were not allowed to develop our own textile mills, you know, iron foundries.
They used the power of the state to maintain their monopoly over these goods and services.
That's right. And the British used tariffs. I mean, they had no tariffs on raw materials coming in, but try to import a piece of cloth to Great Britain? No, you couldn't do it. And they used export emigration visas, exit visas. If you had skills and you knew how to run a textile mill, you could not leave Britain. You were not allowed to leave. The new American nation put a bounty on the heads of people who knew how to do that. They say, we will pay you money. We, you know, it was industrial espionage.
Right, right.
You know, we want those trade secrets. And Cranston Mills in Rhode Island, in existence today, still in business, founded by one of those people. Came over here, he pretended to be an illiterate, you know, peasant. He actually knew how to run a textile mill, and he came over here and set one up.
So America was founded with a lot of black market stuff going on, and you know, like innovators and
yeah. And so it was a rebellion against globalism. The British wanted one world. You know, they wanted this global empire, this globalization, the global economy. The global economy was called the British Empire, right? I mean, and America said, we want to be our own nation. Thank you very much. We're going to be a nation. You know, that goes back to what the Lord said to Abraham. I will make you a nation. He didn't say, I'll make you the global economy. I'll make you a factor in the global economy. I will make you a nation. You will be a nation, and you will prosper. The idea here is that for those who don't like government at all, you can find biblical roots in that.
Right.
I mean, in the oldest of the Old Testament, in Genesis and in Judges and whatnot.
Right.
I mean, it's like, no, you will not have a king. You should not have a government.
Because at the time,
just follow me and you'll be okay.
Yeah, and they had kind of like judges, local judges that would mediate out some of those issues, but it was very decentralized, right?
Yeah.
And the founders kind of had that same appetite.
Yeah.
Well, some of them did. Some of them wanted to go, like Hamilton wanted to go in a different direction of nationalizing things early on, you know.
National identity and yeah.
But you have this localism spirit, right?
Correct.
Localism.
Correct. Localism versus globalism.
Yeah, localism versus globalism, and I think that's the story that we're looking in this new century.
It absolutely.
2020 AD. This is what we're dealing with right now.
Totally, and I'm all on board with that. And it's subsidiarity, right? You want to devolve power to the most local authority. Keep the decision making as close to the ground as possible, not in faraway places. And that was the feeling with the American Revolution. A tyrant in a faraway place is making rules for us. That's not right. We should make rules for ourselves to the greatest practical extent. And that's the thing, that's the fallacy of globalism, is you now, since World War II, there's been this affinity towards multinational companies and transnational authorities, and we're going to make everything more efficient by having one set of rules for the whole world. But it doesn't work that way. You know, the tension is between this globalism and localism. Right. Nationalism versus globalism. Will you have national identity? Will you have local identity? Or will you submerge it into the imperial model? Right. And imperialism and globalism are the same thing. The left to this day for some reason, still thinks that America, the United States of America, the American government, is the imperialist. No, the imperialist power today is the global corporation. And we are all colonies of the global corporation. And there's a tracking or an overlay between the interests of the global corporation and the Chinese Communist Party. And they made that deal. That's the big government, the most powerful government entity on the earth right now is the Chinese government. I don't mean most powerful in the sense that it's the biggest military, but it's like their power is absolute. They have, you make a deal with the Chinese Communist Party, that's it, done. So you've got these powerful global corporations that have found a haven to do their manufacturing and to do their technological development and their research in China. They made that deal. Big corporation, big business, big government. They've made a deal. And monopoly, right? It's big monopoly, or as Solzhenitsyn called it, big solitaire, Right. So you've got monopoly industry and monopoly politics making a deal, and they export to the rest of the world. And we're all resource colonies for them. They'll either farm our brains or they'll farm our raw materials, and they produce, and they set the price. Britain was the workshop of the world. That's what they called themselves in 1776. Now, you can Google it, China is the workshop of the world, the factory floor of the world. The parallels are striking. It's right there.
England used to complain about America because we were making better shoes at a better price and lower wages, right? And the British would say, well, you're exploiting your, that's savages over there, using, primitive, wages and low quality goods, and therefore, that's the narrative that the British Empire had when we were developing our shoes versus their shoes.
We had higher wages here.
Right.
That's why we had the revolution.
Right.
That's why we put the tariffs in place.
Right.
Because we wanted to keep out the cheap goods from Britain. It actually costs more to make cloth here and to make iron here than it did in Britain.
Right.
And Thomas Jefferson said, I will buy American even if it costs more.
Right.
And McKinley said, if well-paid American labor has to compete with poorly paid European labor, our wages will fall, our standard of living will fall, and I will not allow that to happen. The McKinley tariff.
Right.
So we use this wall of tariffs to protect our industries against the cheap. Britain was China. Okay. Britain had the lower paid labor. We wanted better paid labor. Henry Carey, Abraham Lincoln's chief economic advisor, said, we want well-paid labor. We want dear labor. We don't want cheap labor. We want highly paid labor. When people have more money, they will be able to consume more.
Right.
You're a consumer only to the extent that you are a producer, and you must be a producer first. Right? To put it in plain language, you got to make something and sell something in order to have the money to buy something, right?
What do you say to those voices that also would say, well, China's getting the short end of the stick in our relationship because they're buying our treasury bills, they're buying IOUs, and in exchange, they're giving us things that we want, like goods and services or whatever. They're
getting the technological capacity. We're getting trinkets, we're getting glass beads, and they're getting Manhattan Island. They're getting the know-how in the factories to continue producing things, and we're getting the objects of consumption. So
how do we make things in America again? I think we agree that you got to make things if you want to have wealth, right? If you want to pass wealth down to future generations, you have to make stuff. You can't just have a service economy.
You have to dig, grow, and manufacture.
So how do we do that?
Well, we have to go back or go forward to the American system that was posited by people like Henry Clay and Abraham Lincoln and Henry Carey. Protective tariffs, internal improvements, infrastructure, and using the credit of the United States to spur production. As Adam Smith laid out in The Wealth of Nations, is proper use of tariffs to protect industries that are vital to the national defense. he supported the Navigation Acts that protected British shipbuilding and British shipping, right? You couldn't trade anything in the British ports. You couldn't bring it into a British port unless it was on a British ship, because Britain needed its navy, did not want to lose the shipbuilding industry to cheaper foreign competition, right? Look at anything the Pentagon buys. That's vital to the national defense. So there should definitely be Buy American provisions built into what the Pentagon buys. And actually, it's been there since 1930, but we've been giving waiver after waiver after waiver. I've been told that it's impossible for us to build more than 2 submarines at once because we don't have the foundry capacity. We don't have the industrial capacity to produce the parts in great enough volume to make more than 1 submarine at a time. We have lost that much of the industry. The other time it makes perfect sense to use tariffs is when there's a tax put on domestic industry. You should levy an equal tax on the foreign production, foreign industries. So if you were to look at our minimum wage laws, our health and safety laws, our environmental laws, Social Security, Medicare, these are taxes on American producers. I mean, you can't hire somebody here and pay them 13 cents an hour.
Right.
You have to pay them a minimum wage. You can't hire somebody here and tell them to work in that shed out back and pour iron. You know, you've got to give them safety goggles, right? But as long as those regulations and those costs are being imposed on American industry, we should have an equalizing tariff on goods coming from the other country. If we're paying our people $15 an hour, if somebody in another country is paying their people $1 an hour, there should be a $9 an hour tariff. And this is what Teddy Roosevelt called for, equalizing tariff, to equalize the cost of production overseas to the cost of production in the United States. These kind of tariffs were regularly used throughout our history right up till World War I. Another example that Adam Smith wrote about was you cannot allow a surge of imports. When you do want to get rid of tariffs or allow imports, you can't have a surge of imports that will cause a dislocation in the economy. You should do it gradually, right? So let's say we have this highfalutin theory of, you know, one world, borderless, or free flow of people, goods, and money throughout the world, which is, by the way, that's the Treaty of Rome, the free flow of people, goods, and money. That's the European Union, right? You can't do it all at once. You have to take into account the fact that people will lose their jobs, and you can't have such a severe dislocation that you're driving people into poverty. So what we need to do, I would say, is number one, make these tariffs on China permanent. The tariffs that we put, because they are subsidizing their industries. While we are taxing our industries, they're subsidizing their export industries. We have to have an equalizing tariff so that American investors or people who would think of investing in America can't think, well, we're going to go back to the way it was, and we'll be able to build it in China and sell it in the United States without tariffs. We have to give them the certainty. Everybody always talks about business-like certainty. Let's give them some certainty here. These tariffs aren't going away.
So that needs to be legislatively done, right? Is that how that would be
I don't know if it needs to be legislatively done. I think it possibly, if we followed the Constitution,
yeah.
which might be a nice thing, it would be legislatively done, because Article 1, Section 8 gives Congress the power to regulate foreign trade. Unfortunately, Congress has delegated so much of that to the executive that now the president can do things that he didn't used to be able to do.
When you're a small business owner, you simply cannot afford
that's right.
to have your things made here. And how did we get there? And is that something we want to compete with again? And is that possible without, you know what I mean?
I think we absolutely do. I think we want to raise the wages and raise the standard of living of Americans. And the way to do that is the virtuous cycle. Make what we buy, right? Make what we buy and buy what we make to the greatest degree possible. If you can make it here, you should make it here, right?
Right.
I mean, why? Anything else is basically taking advantage of substandard wages or substandard living conditions elsewhere in the world. And now we're all and everybody talks about, oh, well, free trade is great because we have cheaper prices, cheap consumer goods. Cheap consumer goods is cheaper, cheaper, cheaper. That was never the intent, never the design of the founders of this country or the great builders of this country. We don't want cheap. We want expensive. We want well-made, well-compensated. We want labor to be well-compensated. We want producers to be well-compensated. We want farmers to be well-compensated for their production.
And it seems like with the state, it's always going to bear its weight on someone. And in our case, it's bearing all of its weight when it comes to the economics onto its own population and giving the global corporations and other countries a relative easy ride.
Right.
So the taxation burden's on us. The regulation burden's on us. You can't start one time I thought, it'd be cool if you could create a travel company. How would you do that? And I looked into all the costs to enter into creating a travel company.
Yeah.
To give tours to countries, because I like traveling when I was younger. And I was like, there's no way I could afford this when I was a young college. I was like, why does it, you have to have this license, you have to have this thing, you have to have this thing, you have to have that thing. It's all regulated by corporatism to prevent competition. So therefore, the little guy says, all right, well, I guess I'm going to go work at Wendy's. I'm in college. I was going to start a travel company, but government has made X amount. I can't do it. So it's like, so that it feels like we're squeezed between the regulatory state, the inflationary monetary system, the taxes, because that's another issue that the middle class gets squeezed by. And you're squeezed between that and then these corporations, like you were mentioning, working with these government-owned factories overseas, and we're just being squeezed like a vice grip.
That's right.
The vast majority of the middle class, which is where we're supposed to produce things from, are just being squeezed by these forces domestically and internationally. And it's a pressure cooker kind of environment here.
And you're just talking about economically. Yeah, we're caught in this squeeze that there's no revenue coming in because somebody who's earning $50 an hour making automobiles pays taxes. Somebody earning $7 an hour as a Walmart greeter part-time is not paying taxes. They're probably on welfare in some form or another. So that's structural deficits right there.
And you're saying take that tax structure and put it back onto the tariff frame to get more consistent revenues. That's what you're saying?
I'm saying that, yes. Yeah. Get rid of, for the first 150 years of our country, we did not tax Americans. We taxed foreigners.
I think that's the better way that we should go back to.
Right. Tax the foreigners. If you want to make it somewhere else and bring it into this country, you're going to pay a duty on it.
If you got rid of the income tax here and the corporate income tax, and then you replace that revenue with a tariff complex and fees, I think that would be a boom for our. It would be a boom, wouldn't it?
No, that's a revolutionary concept. It's funny that you used to hear others, the anti-tax crusaders, talk about starving the beast. Right? We're going to get rid of this regulatory state by starving it of resources. Right? But if you ever said to them, well, okay, let's get rid of the income tax and replace it with tariffs, they would scream again. Oh, no, you can't do that because tariffs are like, I don't know, somebody told me once it was bad. It's a dirty word. Look, you're never going to be able to, you probably could not, and I haven't done the math on this. I'll ask some of my friends who are, have a sharper pencil than I do. You probably couldn't have high enough tariffs to fund the regulatory state we have now.
Right.
So the best way to do it would be exactly what you said. Get rid of the income tax. We're going to replace revenues with tariffs and then start chopping away everything we can't afford anymore.
Because the thing about the regulatory state that I think is missing, we're missing this in our national conversation right now, is that the Galileos, the Teslas, the Henry Fords, the ones who create these with their teams, they get prevented by regulatory capture.
Exactly.
And so it's like, what are you going to do? You're going to just keep regulating? Are you going to get a bureaucracy of monopolists like government to say, can you please let Galileo through the mail? He's got an idea. Can you let Galileo speak? Can you let Tesla speak? No. Why should I? I have no competition. I've got the monopoly power of the state. We're going to keep taking care of the horseshoe maker, so to speak. We're going to keep taking care of the old idea.
Right.
And it's you got to get rid of the regulatory burden and then get rid of that tax burden and allow for, that to be replaced by a tariff wall. I think that's a great direction. I think there's a lot of broad agreement and opportunity for a lot of working together across American ideas.
Absolutely.
If we use that kind of blueprint you were suggesting of small, not big, you got to think small, local, and decentralize power, decentralize it as much as you can, and think about taking care of your neighbor first before you want to solve the world's problems, right?
Yeah. That's right.
That's that common sense thing I think everybody can get around. Right?
And I think that's the way forward. That's the way to get off of this impasse of, oh, government great, government bad, government great. Let's just deal with what's at hand here. We want to do what's right for our neighbor, do what's right for ourselves, and localism I think is the key here. Instead of regulated monopolies, have regulated competition. I know regulation is a bad word, but this is not necessarily. What's the goal here? The goal is widely distributed private property. I believe in private property so much, I want everybody to have some. I don't want everybody to be a clerk in a bureaucracy, right? Whether it's a socialist bureaucracy or a corporatist capitalist bureaucracy. I don't want everybody to be a cubicle worker. Right? I think it's better, even if it's not more efficient by some standard of green eye shade calculation. Even if it's not more efficient that way, let's have more people, owning things, doing things on their own, working with their neighbors rather than working for a far away, corporate shareholder, manager, HR department.